There's an argument that I've been seeing online for really years now, which is that trans people are statistically more likely to be sex offenders. Sex offender is a category of crime that is basically any crime that has anything to do with sex. So sexual assault, rape, possession of child pornography, indecent exposure, pedophilia, a criminal pervert, if you will. The idea that trans people are perverts is an old stereotype, but what if it also turned out to be true? Like, statistically, on average. There are some unfortunately true statistics about small groups of people, like how black people are more likely to do certain kinds of crime, and gay men are more likely to have STDs, and trans people are more likely to be suicidal. So is it possible that we're also statistically more likely to sexually assault people? I thought about this for a while, and whether it maps onto my own experience, it didn't sound right to me. I understand the suicidality. You can observe that just by making friends with a dozen random trans women, but trans women don't usually seem like the type to go out and sexually assault anybody. But maybe trans women are such a small subset of people in the first place that it doesn't take much for an even smaller subset of abusers to become statistically significant. Like, imagine if 1% of people were murderers and then 2% of trans women were murderers. You might not notice in your daily experience, so I don't know. And there's a lot of potentially confounding variables here because trans people are a troubled demographic, more likely to be socially maladjusted, to have problems with their family, to feel rejected by society or their community. And I think it is true that trans women are more likely to be open or progressive about sex and sexuality. So maybe there's something to this. It's not beyond imagination. Then I looked into it. And how was any of this verified? The idea that us being sexual perverts was actually confirmed after all this time? You know, the numbers are in, they've confirmed it. Oh, it was by prison statistics. The idea that we're more likely to be sex offenders all came back to the same few sources, claiming that a higher percentage of trans people in prison are sex offenders compared with the general prisoner population. Wait. Does nobody hear the problem with that? Maybe they don't. Statistics are tricky for many people, and sometimes the correct inference is not the intuitive one. Even if this claim were true as presented, it would not entail the conclusion that's being offered. For injecting this rhetoric into our discourse, we can thank the UK-based group called Fair Play for Women, a leader in trying to sound the alarm on the very serious issue of trans perverts trying to sneak into women's prisons. I don't think anybody was making this argument until they publicized it, so yeah, awesome. First, let's uncritically accept all of the data and just see where that takes us. The UK prison service is split into 3 separate systems: England and Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. We're only going to be talking about the first because it is by far the largest, and the other 2 were less willing to share their numbers. In 2017, the combined population of England and Wales was 58 million, about 89% of the UK population. In the Associated Prison Network, there were 71,200 prisoners. Of that, 13,500 were doing time for a sexual offense of some kind. That's about 19% of prisoners, or 0.023% of the general population. Why am I mentioning 2017 of all years? Well, it was in 2018 that the Ministry of Justice replied to a Freedom of Information request by reporters at the BBC, who were covering the Fair Play for Women story, revealing that in the previous year, 2017, to their knowledge, there were 125 trans prisoners in the England and Wales prison system, and of those, 60 were doing time for at least one sexual offense. That's 48%, which is higher than the general prison inmate population's sexual offense rate of 19%, more than double. So, is that it? Suspicions confirmed? Trans women sexual offenders? For many people at this point, the intuitive conclusion was that if trans prisoners are more likely to be sex offenders, then that means trans people are more likely to do sexual offenses. But that doesn't actually follow, because this difference could just as well be the result of trans people being less likely to do literally any other type of crime. Talking about proportions can be very misleading for this reason. To illustrate what I mean, imagine there's 2 equally sized groups in a country. The first group has 100 murderers and 100 thieves. The second group has 30 murderers and 25 thieves. It would be true, given these numbers, to say that a higher proportion of the second group's prisoners are murderers. But is the second group more likely to murder? Well, clearly not. They're way less likely, but they're even less likely to steal, meaning a higher proportion of their criminals are murderers, 30 out of 55 instead of 100 out of 200. If trans women were to commit every single crime at the exact same rate as everybody else, except for murder, where instead they were to commit much less murder, it would logically follow from that difference alone that they're more likely to be sex offenders. It would also follow they're more likely to commit fraud and vandalism and literally every other kind of crime other than murder. I assume you see the problem here. If you wanted to talk about how likely a group is to do a crime in the first place, then what you should be talking about is how many times a member of that group does the crime in question in comparison with the size of the group. This should really be obvious because that's how we talk about questions like this in pretty much every other context. So there's 58 million people in the general population, and of that, 13,500 are sex offenders. And in the trans population, there's 125 sex offenders. The missing variable is, how many trans people are there? And that is not an easy question to answer. In 2018, when this conversation was first being pushed, there was no concrete answer for the number of trans people. It was all just tentative estimates. The Government Equalities Office published a fact sheet that same year where they replied to the question by saying they don't know, and pointing out there is no robust data on the total number of trans people, but they did offer a tentative estimate of between 200,000 and 500,000 in the UK. The UK population at this time was 66.4 million, meaning the estimate was between 0.3 and 0.75% of the population. That's in line with many other population estimates I've seen, maybe skewed a little bit high, but reasonable. Now, in 2018, we had nothing better to work with, so we could have tried to be neutral and just taken the midpoint of this estimate, so 350,000. That's 0.5%. But that is for all of the UK, whereas our prison stat is only for England and Wales, so to get an adjusted estimate, we'll multiply that by 0.89 to get 311,500. This would mean 0.53% of the general population of 58.74 million are trans. How accurate is this estimate? Well, at the time, nobody knew for sure. And the people who were trying to suggest that trans people are more likely to be sex offenders didn't even bother using any numbers here. They didn't even try to make these comparisons. The simplest way to think about it is that 60 trans prisoners being sex offenders out of the 13,500 sex offenders in the general prison population makes trans people 0.444 repeating percent of sex offenders. Now, if trans people are 0.53% of the population, but they're only 0.44% of sex offenders, well, that doesn't show trans overrepresentation among sex offenders. If the game we're playing is taking these tentative government-provided estimates at face value and running with them, the conclusion we should have come to is that trans people are less likely to be sex offenders and less likely to be criminals in general. But the fewer trans people who exist in society, the higher a percentage of them those 60 sex offenders in prison will represent. So if you want trans people to look bad, you need to make the total population of trans people lower. And if you want trans people to look better, then you would need to make the total number of trans people higher. Since the trans sex offenders in prison are 0.444% of the total sex offenders in prison, trans people being greater than 0.444% of the population means they're less likely to be sex offenders, and trans people being less than that means they're more likely to be sex offenders. So now it's just a matter of playing with the numbers. How can we make trans people look worse? Let's assume that trans men are half the trans population, but don't contribute to any of the sexual offenses. All trans crime is done by trans women. This justifies narrowing our comparison from trans people as a group to only trans women as a group, which effectively halves the trans population estimate and doubles the crime rate, because the total number of crimes will remain the same. But if we do this, I guess we should also split up the non-trans population by sex as well, and compare trans women, trans men, men and women, all together, to get a full picture of what we're talking about. So what does that look like? In a 2017 report on the UK prison population, you can see sexual offences are 99% done by males, with less than 1% by females. In Britain, women also generally outnumber men by over a whole percentage point. I can't find the exact numbers for 2017, but in the 2021 census, England and Wales had 30.4 million females and 29.2 million males. We can take this and apply it to the 13,500 reported sex offenders to say 13,365 were males and 135 were females. Probably. For comparison, though, in 2016 they did report the gendered values, and the results were 13,808 males and 126 females, which is roughly the same proportion as I ended up with anyway. So what percentage of males are sex offenders, what percentage of females are sex offenders, and then what percentage of trans women are sex offenders if, again, we're supposing that trans men don't do any crime, we're just kind of excluding them from the comparison. It ends up looking like this. Males are at 0.04, females are at 0.0004, and then trans women are... Oh, wait. We didn't actually resolve how many trans women I should assume exist. The lower number you pick, the higher this percentage will end up being. If you assume the worst and take the lowest point of the estimate and then cut that in half to get only the trans women, that's 100,000, which gives us 0.06. That is a higher rate than the males and a way higher rate than the females. This is the worst case scenario that I can put together using the tentative estimates taken from the UK government. So the question is, if this were the case, would this justify anti-trans fear and hatred? Should women feel cautious or unsafe around trans women because the possibility of her being a sexual offender is higher than average by some fraction of a percent? Somehow, no, I don't think you should. To put this into perspective, if you're in a room with 10,000 men and 10,000 trans women, statistically, there would be 4 sex offenders in the male group and 6 in the trans women group. I can also safely say that you encounter way more than 1.5 times as many men as trans women throughout your life, so the number of male sex offenders that you encounter is going to be way more than the number of trans women sex offenders. It's possible that some people's goal in talking about these numbers is not informing general attitudes about trans people, but a policy discussion strictly about where trans women should be imprisoned. In theory, if every trans woman sent to prison ended up being a sex offender, then it doesn't really matter whether trans women are more likely to be sex offenders on average. One could still reason that perhaps we shouldn't send them into the women's prisons if we know they're all sex offenders. This could be something that a reasonable person who does not hate trans women thinks. Now, this argument still has other problems, which I'll address later, but the more general problem is how this statistic is being used, because the implicit claim that trans women are more likely to be sex offenders has just become a general anti-trans point, not limited to disagreements about prison policy. Now let's try not just uncritically accepting all of the data, because it turns out there are a lot of problems in the assumptions I've made so far. First of all, how does the prison service even know if you're trans? When you're booked into prison, they take your ID, and if you're a trans woman and you've had your legal gender changed to female, as far as the prison service is concerned, you're not trans, you're just a woman. When a reporter asks the prison service about their trans prisoners, the answer they're getting is only the people whose legal gender hasn't been changed, and as such their expressed gender identity is different from their legal gender. That is the functional definition of trans prisoner as far as the prison service is concerned. However, it turns out that changing your gender in the UK is a time-consuming process that many trans people haven't bothered doing. You've been able to apply for a Gender Recognition Certificate, or a GRC, since 2004, but by around 2018, only 8,000 of these things had been issued ever, in total. This means the total number of trans prisoners with a GRC is presumably low, and their exclusion from the count might be assumed to not make a big difference. But I am cautious about this because we're talking about very small sample size comparisons, so it doesn't take a lot to make a difference. The prison service only realizes and makes note of the fact a person is trans during what's called a case conference. This is when a prisoner meets with numerous prison agents and other people supporting them, which can include people from outside the system like a family member, to discuss their needs and their situation. A prison only arranges a case conference if you're going to be in prison for a long time. How long? I don't know. There doesn't seem to be a concrete limit, but possibly about 6 months to a year. This means if you're in prison for a short period of time, you may not have a case conference, and as such you may never be counted as a trans prisoner. This means the trans prison population that actually gets recorded is biased toward longer prison durations, such as for sexual offenses, which are presumably you're going to be in prison longer for. Here's another question. How many of the people we're talking about are actually trans women? The prison service doesn't actually break down those 60 sex offenders by gender. In a separate document, which has nothing to do with sexual offenses, they say that of the 125 trans prisoners, 23 reported their gender as female and 99 as male. Does that mean 99 trans men or trans women? I checked out the 2016 report, which was similarly ambiguous, but then in this release from 2022, after the way that they record this information had been updated, it says 187 trans inmates claim their legal gender is male, and 168 of those are transgender females, which it defines as a person who identifies as female, but whose legal gender is still male. 43 say their legal gender is female, with 41 self-identifying as transgender males. Unless this ratio flipped over a 5 to 6 year period from 80% of trans prisoners being trans men in 2016 down to only 20% of them in 2022, which isn't actually impossible, I guess, but I mean, if we assume that's not what happened, then this would suggest that those documents from years earlier were listing self-reported legal gender, meaning it was 99 trans women and 23 trans men, and that the footnote is just saying we can't guarantee that this actually is their legal gender, we just asked them and this is what they said. Anyway, among that group, there were 60 sexual offenses of some kind. How many trans men were responsible for any of those 60 sexual offenses in 2017? We don't know. That number was not released. As far as I'm aware, they've never specified this. But the point is that it could have been more than 0, couldn't it have? Trans men take testosterone. Have you seen some of these guys? They could be going out and doing crimes. And if literally any of them were, this becomes yet another factor that biases towards a higher sexual offense rate, which is going to be misinterpreted as being trans women. Finally, and I think most importantly, we're talking about really small sample sizes that fluctuate significantly between years. This is why people usually talk about averages of ranges of things, because numbers can vary without discernible reason over time. In this case, there was no average. There was no attempt at normalization. We picked a year, essentially at random, and then we're extrapolating and trying to make a whole case out of this as though these numbers are the numbers. But if we had picked a different year, a very different story could have been told. For example, the number of trans prisoners in 2017 was 125, but only a year prior, we don't know how many of them were serving time for a sexual offense of some kind, but the total number of trans prisoners that year was 70. Why the difference? What happened? Did trans people really become twice as likely to do crimes in a year? No, of course not. It probably doesn't mean anything. These are just 2 points on what should have been a curve, a big graph of data, but that we don't have. We just have 1 point. We don't know what the other points are. And if it had been consistently 48% of trans prisoners who are sex offenders, that would have meant that in 2016 there would be 33 trans prisoners with sex offenses, not 60. That would have completely deflated all of the anti-trans articles written about this, because even the most uncharitable assumptions that I made earlier would have been well below the general rate of sexual offenses. We could also imagine, by the way, a completely different story depending on where in the world you're making this comparison. Like, are England's numbers going to be the same as the numbers in Italy, Sweden, Ecuador? From the very first section, as soon as I realized the way that they were making this comparison about the proportions, it seemed like an obviously shaky narrative, but taking these points into account, I would say the whole thing just falls apart, and it really shows you the complete lack of rigor with which these people are making these arguments. This argument had already been around for a few years when I saw Elon Musk share a post on his Twitter that included some even more unfavorable numbers than I was used to seeing. It relies on claiming there are only 48,000 trans women in the UK, resulting in a very high sexual offense rate based on the same prison stats from years prior. Where did this come from? Now, in 2021, 2 countries, the UK and Canada, both did their national census, and both became the first countries to attempt measuring how many trans people exist. Canada asked 2 questions: sex at birth, which they had always asked, and gender identity, a new field. They could then count how many people answered these 2 questions differently. The UK asked for your basic info, and then also asked, is the gender you identify with the same as your sex registered at birth? Slightly different approaches, and both approaches were criticized because you can never please anyone. It is possible that people who have poor English skills misunderstood the way these questions were phrased, but for the first time this at least gave us something concrete to work with, instead of always just talking about tentative extrapolations, even if the resulting data is faulty, and I'm sure that we'll get more accurate measures in the future. But for now, here's what we ended up with. In the United Kingdom, 262,000 people answered yes, their gender identity is different from their sex at birth. In a country of 67 million, this means 0.4% are trans, which is a bit on the low side of that estimated range the government had provided years earlier, which was 0.3 to 0.75%. In Canada, the result was 120,000 people. In a country of 38.2 million, this gives us 0.31% of the country. Broken down by province, the highest reported amount was in Nova Scotia, a small eastern province, while in Ontario, the by far most populous province, you see numbers roughly the same as the national average. In Quebec, the second most populous, it's a bit lower, while in BC, the third most populous, it's a bit higher. Let's think about what might be happening in a census. It's possible that things get overreported sometimes, because some people might just randomly mark yes for no reason, despite not really being that committed to living as trans. Which could also be the case for prisoners, by the way. But personally, I would expect false negatives to be even more numerous. I would predict and expect the number of trans people on a national census to be lower in an area where the culture is more conservative and anti-trans. Not because trans people actually have a lower incidence rate in that population, but just because those cultures are really prejudiced against such an identity. I would expect the same thing if you were to even anonymously ask people about their sexuality. This was the case in our society generations ago, and is still the case with various immigrant cultures. The most undistorted number is probably going to be among the population that's least closed off to the possibility, where people are most able to express as trans if that's what they are. Today that probably means younger people whose parents were born in the country, or something like that. And over time I would expect the general percentage to drift toward that subset, which is also what I would expect when it comes to how many people in society are gay or bi. You may have heard that a higher percentage of young people answer yes to that than older people, and I think what you're seeing there is just the real incidence rate emerging as you remove the social repression that kept that number low among the older population. Now, you don't have to agree with my interpretation of the census. I could be wrong about this part, but I just thought I would share my interpretation of these results. Even if we don't assume that this number is at all underreported and we just roll with it, where did they get 48,000 from? The answer is that in the UK census, if you answer yes to the first question, you're offered an optional follow-up question. Oh, you don't identify as your birth sex? Well, then what gender are you? There was just an empty box where you could write in anything you want, or nothing. It was optional. Of the 262,000 people who said they were trans in some way, only 48,000 specifically wrote in the term trans woman. We don't know how many of them wrote woman, which is probably what I'd have written. Like, that's how I would have interpreted this box. But we do know that of the total count of 262,000, over 100,000 didn't bother writing anything in that box. So to take the 48,000 as the real number is obviously absurd. But remember, the kind of person who creates an image like this is motivated to make trans people look bad, not to portray the truth as clearly as possible. They saw an opportunity to twist the facts by using this misleading reported statistic of 48,000, and they took it. And Elon Musk retweeted it, and God knows how many people fell for it. Okay, final question. Is this even a real issue? To be clear, most of the people online who amplify this trans women are sex offenders thing are not doing so out of concern for female prison inmates. They just hate trans women and they want you to hate us too. And they try to do this by making trans women seem like a threat to cis women, whom they gallantly want to defend from us. It might not surprise you to learn that transphobia is much less common in women. It is mostly men who are gravely concerned about all this. But there are some people operating out of genuine fear, including women who do get sucked into all of this, and they are afraid of being abused by men, and to some of them trans women appear simply as males who might abuse them, or in some cases they might agree that trans women aren't the same as men, but they're nervous that policies meant to accommodate trans women will create vulnerabilities or exploits in our system that men could then abuse. And it's understandable that women are protective of female spaces. That's why there is a respectable position on prisons, especially, born out of a real concern for women inmates. The question ends up being, should we let any guy who claims to be trans go to the women's prison? Is that a bad policy? Will that lead to bad outcomes? Could that be unfair to women? If you haven't spent much time looking into it, you might think that trans women are indeed just moved into women's prisons at their own request without having to prove or demonstrate anything, because that's exactly what anti-trans groups try to imply. They want you to imagine that a prisoner can just raise their hand and say, "Hey, I'm a woman now," and then the government takes you at your word and throws you in with the girls. And if that were the case, I think pretty much everybody would agree there's a problem. In 2022, there were 187 trans women in prison. Of those, 6 had been moved to female prisons. 6. The decision to move them is made only after a case conference and after an individual risk assessment, meaning it's done on a case-by-case basis. There is no policy of automatically letting all trans women into women's prisons. It's made up. This is not a problem. That being said, there have been some mishandled cases. In 2018, it was reported that there was a 52-year-old male who was allowed to move into female prison, only for him to assault another inmate and get transferred back to male prison a few months later. I guess that was obviously a mistaken judgment by whoever was in charge. Maybe he was really convincing. Maybe the fact he was 52 made them think it wouldn't be an issue because he was, like, kinda on the old side. I don't know. Either way, this was an exceptional mistake. It's not something that happens often. Anti-trans activists used this person's photograph to make some frightening propaganda, but they're amplifying this one case to make the issue seem way bigger than it really is. And they know that. We need to have more faith in the people who are in charge of running our prisons. It turns out the prison service people, they're not stupid. I think the worst part about this topic is that I can try to be understanding of women who are just genuinely concerned about potential abuse, but there's pretty much never any concern from the other side about the potential for trans women to be victimized in prison. Trans women don't want to go to female prison just for fun. It's for their own protection, for their own safety. I have seen this topic discussed online so many times, and I've never seen the people who are so concerned about protecting female prison inmates express any kind of care or concern about trans women getting abused in male prison if they got their way. By the way, when I looked at Canada's census results, I was curious if things were being inflated by the First Nations population being more likely to identify as non-binary, since that's a phenomenon associated with their culture, which they call being two-spirited. I took available data for the Canadian provinces and territories by percentage of population with First Nation identity to sort the census data on self-reported trans identity by Aboriginal percentage, and the result is that you don't see noticeably more people self-identifying as trans in the regions with more Aboriginal people. The Yukon Territory does have the highest reported rate of non-binary people in the country, but even if we make the strongest assumptions about that being affected by their Aboriginal population, the overall impact of some First Nation overrepresentation would be completely negligible in the big picture simply because the total population of those provinces is incredibly small.